The wind howled across the empty fields, carrying with it the smell of dust and cold iron. Tessa's bare feet stumbled over the rough earth, her breath ragged as she ran, heart pounding harder than the drums of war. Behind her, the shadows of the men who once called themselves her family grew longer in the failing light. Every lash of their voices echoed in her ears, cruel reminders of a life she could no longer endure. "Run, girl. You'll never get far," her father's voice thundered, heavy with drunken rage. But Tessa did not stop. She would not stop. Every beat of her heart screamed for freedom, even as her legs threatened to give way beneath her. She had nothing left but the tattered dress clinging to her body and the desperate will to survive. The night wrapped around her, unforgiving, cold. She could already imagine the punishment if they caught her. Her father's hand, the sting of his belt, the endless torment that had carved scars deeper than flesh. No. She would rather collapse in the wilderness than return to that prison. Her strength faltered. Her steps slowed. The world tilted and spun before her eyes, until finally her knees buckled. She fell hard against the ground, her face brushing the dirt as darkness clawed at her mind. And then hooves. The sound rose from the earth like thunder, steady, powerful. She forced her eyes open, barely clinging to consciousness, and through the haze she saw a rider approaching. A tall man astride a broad-shouldered horse, his frame commanding against the moonlight. He dismounted swiftly, his boots crunching against the earth. He knelt beside her, his voice deep and steady. "Easy now," he said. "You're safe." Safe. The word felt foreign to her, almost cruel in its gentleness. Strong arms lifted her from the ground, and though her body tensed with fear, exhaustion overpowered her resistance. Her head rested against his chest, and for the first time in years, she felt warmth. She did not know his name, nor why he had stopped for her, but she clung to that single word he had given her. Safe. When she woke, she was wrapped in a quilt softer than anything she had ever known. The air smelled of wood smoke and bread. The cabin around her was humble but solid, built with care. Sunlight poured through a small window, painting the room in gold. She stirred, her body aching, and the man appeared in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and steady eyes that carried no cruelty in them. "You're awake," he said simply. She tried to sit up, her voice little more than a whisper. "Where am I?" "My home," he answered. "Name's Bo Carter." She hesitated, uncertain whether to speak her own name. But the kindness in his gaze pressed the truth from her lips. "Tessa." Bo nodded, as though he had been waiting for her to trust him. "Well, Tessa, you're safe here. No one will hurt you." Safe. Again that word. This time, it did not feel like a lie. Days passed, and with them, the terror inside her began to loosen. Bo was not a man of many words, but every action spoke louder than promises. He left food for her, wood by the fire, water by the bed. He asked no questions she was not ready to answer. In his silence, she found peace. And then, inevitably, the past came for her. One morning, voices rose outside the cabin. Rough, familiar voices that made her blood turn to ice. Her father's voice among them, cruel and commanding. "Bring her out," he roared. "She's mine." Bo stood at the door, unmoving. "She's not yours. Not anymore." The clash that followed was swift and brutal. Tessa could do nothing but press herself against the window, heart hammering as fists flew and steel flashed. Her father and brothers fought with desperation, but Bo fought with purpose. He was defending not just a woman, but the very idea of her freedom. At last, her father lay broken in the dirt, his fury quenched by defeat. Her brothers, shamed, dragged him away. None dared to meet Tessa's eyes. The silence afterward was heavy, but it was not empty. For the first time, she felt the weight of her chains fall away. In the weeks that followed, healing began. Slowly, her scars faded, not all of them visible, but each one tended with care. She learned to smile again, to laugh, to trust. Bo never pushed her. He only stood beside her until she was ready to walk her own steps. And when she did, she chose him. Their vows were spoken not in grandeur but in honesty. A promise of protection, of partnership, of a love born from freedom. Seasons turned. The cabin grew warmer, filled with new sounds, her laughter, his steady voice, and one day the fragile cries of their child. Tessa held her baby close, tears streaming down her face as Bo wrapped his arm around her. For all the darkness that had once threatened to consume her, she had found the light. She was home. The days grew longer, marked by the steady rhythm of life on the homestead. Morning light spilled over the hills, warming the frost-kissed grass, and the smell of coffee drifted through the cabin. Bo rose early each day, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floorboards, his presence as constant and grounding as the rising sun. For Tessa, each dawn carried with it something she had never known before: peace. She woke without fear of a door slamming open, without the heavy tread of her father's boots announcing another day of cruelty. Instead, she woke to birdsong, to the creak of Bo's rocking chair, to the gentle scrape of his knife whittling wood by the fire. At first, she moved through the cabin like a guest, unsure of her place. She folded the blanket he had given her, washed her dishes carefully, and stayed out of his way. But Bo noticed. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the table, he set down his fork and spoke in that quiet, steady tone that always seemed to cut straight through her doubts. "You don't have to walk on eggshells here, Tessa. This is your home as much as mine." Her throat tightened. Home. A word she had never dared to claim. From then on, something shifted. She began to weave her presence into the fabric of the cabin. She mended a torn shirt of his. She baked bread, the smell of it filling the air and drawing a rare smile to his face. She swept the hearth, humming softly, the sound surprising even herself. And slowly, the silence between them grew comfortable, filled with small gestures that spoke louder than words. But healing was not without its shadows. At night, she still woke in a sweat, her heart racing as her father's voice echoed in her dreams. Some mornings, she startled at sudden noises, her body bracing for blows that never came. Bo never scolded her for it. Instead, he would simply sit nearby, silent but present, his steady eyes a reminder that the past could not reach her here. One crisp autumn evening, as the sky burned orange over the fields, Tessa sat on the porch, watching the horizon. Bo joined her, lowering himself into the chair beside her. They sat in silence for a long while before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand why you're helping me. Why you let me stay." Bo glanced at her, his expression unreadable at first. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because everyone deserves a chance at freedom. You needed one. I could give it." Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. No one had ever spoken to her like that, without expectation, without ownership, without cruelty. Just truth. In that moment, something rooted itself deep in her heart. A fragile trust, delicate as new grass, but alive. The seasons turned, and with them came change. Winter arrived in a sweep of snow and biting wind, sealing them in the cabin together. Far from making her restless, the closeness gave Tessa a sense of belonging she had never known. They chopped wood side by side, cooked meals over the fire, and shared quiet evenings by the flickering light. There were no declarations, no hurried promises. Only the steady, growing bond between two souls who had both known loss, now finding strength in each other. One night, as the snowstorm howled outside, Tessa sat by the fire, sewing by lamplight. Bo watched her, his gaze steady, then finally spoke. "Tessa." She looked up, her needle pausing. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." His voice was firm, but gentle, as though he were laying down an oath. "Not while I'm here." Her breath caught. For years, she had carried fear like a second skin. To hear those words, spoken with such certainty, unraveled something inside her. Without thinking, she rose and crossed the room, sitting beside him. Her hand trembled as she reached for his, half expecting him to pull away. But Beau's hand closed over hers, steady and strong, anchoring her. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, of promise, of trust, of something deeper than either dared to name just yet. And for the first time, Tessa let herself believe it. Perhaps she truly was safe. Spring crept into the valley like a gentle hand brushing away winter's scars. The snow melted from the hills, rivers swelled with fresh water, and tender green shoots pushed through the thawing soil. With the earth came renewal, and with renewal, Tessa found herself breathing easier, as though her lungs were finally learning what it meant to fill with air untainted by fear. The cabin no longer felt like Beau's home, it felt like theirs. Her touch was everywhere now. Quilts she had mended draped across chairs, jars of herbs and dried fruit lining the shelves, flowers gathered in a vase on the table. She moved with a quiet confidence that had once seemed impossible. Beau noticed. Though he rarely spoke of such things, his gaze lingered on her more often. He saw how her hair caught the light when she leaned over the garden bed, how her laughter carried when she fed the hens, how her voice, soft but steady, brought warmth into the rooms that had long stood silent. Yet peace was fragile, and shadows of the past still stretched long. One morning, as Tessa hung laundry beneath the bright sky, she froze at the sound of approaching riders. Hooves struck the earth, heavy and purposeful. Her heart stuttered, a cold dread flooding her veins. Memories clawed their way to the surface. Her father's fury, her brother's jeers, the cage of that life she had fled. Beau stepped out from the barn, his hand already brushing the butt of his revolver. His eyes narrowed as the riders came into view. Two men, broad-shouldered, faces roughened by sun and bitterness. Her brothers. "Tessa," one of them called, his voice sharp with command. "We've come for you. You don't belong here." Her blood turned to ice, but before she could find her voice, Beau spoke, his tone calm but edged with steel. "She belongs where she chooses. And she's chosen here." The words cut through the air like a blade. The brothers dismounted, fists clenched, eyes flashing. "She's our kin," the elder snarled. "She's coming back with us. Father says." "Your father has no claim here," Beau interrupted, his voice low, firm. "Not over her. Not anymore." The standoff thickened, the air heavy with tension. Tessa's hands trembled, clutching the fabric she had dropped to the ground. For years, her voice had been silenced beneath the weight of fear. But now, standing in the shadow of the man who had given her safety, something inside her shifted. No, her voice rang out, stronger than she expected. Both brothers turned to stare at her, shock flashing across their faces. "I will not go back," she said, each word steady, defiant. "Not now. Not ever." Silence followed, thick and charged. Her brothers exchanged a look, anger simmering in their eyes, but something else too, a glimmer of uncertainty. They had known her only as the frightened, beaten girl who cowered beneath their father's shadow. They did not know this woman, standing firm beside the man who would not let them take her. Beau took a step forward, his hand resting casually on his revolver, though his voice remained even. "You heard her. Now get off my land." For a long, tense moment, it seemed violence would break. But the brothers, sensing the steel in Beau's stance and the unshakable resolve in Tessa's eyes, finally backed down. "This ain't over," one spat, mounting his horse. "Father won't stand for it." "Then he'll learn," Beau replied. The riders turned, galloping back into the distance, leaving only the churned dirt of their tracks and the pounding of Tessa's heart. Her knees weakened, but before she could sink to the ground, Beau's arm was around her, steady and certain. "You did it," he said quietly. "You stood your ground." Tessa looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears, not of fear, but of release. For the first time in her life, she had spoken her truth aloud, and no one had silenced her. The fear had not vanished, but it no longer held her captive. With Beau beside her, with her own voice rising from within, she was free. That night, as they sat by the fire, she rested her head against his shoulder, exhaustion giving way to peace. The flames crackled, shadows danced, and Bo's arm tightened gently around her. The storm had not passed completely. She knew her father would not yield so easily, but for the first time she felt certain she would not face it alone. And that certainty was enough to carry her forward. The threat lingered long after her brothers rode away. Though the farm returned to its quiet rhythm, Tessa could feel it pressing at the edges of her peace, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. She knew her father's pride would not allow such defiance to go unanswered. And yet, for the first time in her life, she did not shrink beneath that knowledge. Bo's presence gave her strength. Each day he worked beside her, steady and dependable, his silence more comforting than any false promise could ever be. He never treated her as fragile glass. He gave her the space to grow roots, to find her footing. And she did. The garden flourished beneath her care, rows of tender shoots rising from the dark soil. Chickens scratched happily in the yard, their clucking a strange music that made her smile. The cabin, once stark and bare, now breathed with life. Tessa's laughter, tentative at first, wove itself into its walls until it seemed the place itself held warmth. But Bo was not blind to the shadows she carried. Some nights, when the wind rattled the shutters, Tessa would wake trembling, certain she heard her father's boots pounding outside. Bo never pressed her with questions. He simply lit the lamp, poured her a cup of water, and sat beside her until the fear ebbed. His patience, more than anything, became her anchor. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun melt into the horizon, Tessa spoke words she had long held back. "I used to believe I was nothing," she said softly, her hands twisting in her lap. "That I had no worth beyond doing as I was told. My father made sure of that." Bo turned his head, his gaze steady, waiting. "But here," she looked out across the fields, her voice trembling but certain. "Here I feel different. Like I'm more than what he said I was. Like maybe I belong." For a long moment Bo said nothing. Then he reached over, covering her hand with his own. His touch was warm, grounding. "You do belong," he said simply. The words sank deep, and for once she did not question them. The days stretched into weeks, and the bond between them grew, not in sudden bursts but in the slow, steady way of things meant to last. Their conversations were often brief, but every glance, every gesture carried weight. When Bo passed her tools in the garden, his fingers brushing hers, something sparked that left her breathless. When she mended the tears in his work shirts, her stitches were guided not just by duty, but by care. Still, beneath the quiet rhythm of their days, an unspoken tension lingered. The memory of her father's fury was never far, and both knew it was only a matter of time before he returned. The confrontation came sooner than expected. It was late afternoon when dust rose on the horizon, a line of riders cutting through the fields. Bo spotted them first, his jaw tightening as he set down the axe he had been using to split wood. "Tessa," he said quietly, "go inside." But she did not move. She had run from her father all her life. She would not hide now. The riders drew closer, their faces grim. At their head was her father, his eyes burning with a venom she knew too well. "You think you can steal my daughter?" he bellowed, reining in his horse. "You think you can shame me in front of this whole county?" Bo stepped forward, his stance unflinching. "She isn't yours to claim. She's mine by blood," her father roared. His gaze snapped to Tessa, cold and merciless. "Get over here, girl. Now." Tessa's chest tightened, but her feet held firm. She met his gaze for the first time without bowing her head. "No," she said, her voice steady, clear. "I will not." Her father's face twisted, rage spilling into every line. "You ungrateful!" He swung down from his horse, his hand reaching for the whip at his belt. Bo moved faster. He stepped between them, his voice low but thunderous. "Touch her, and you'll answer to me." The tension cracked like lightning. Her brothers shifted uneasily on their horses, their loyalty faltering beneath the weight of their father's rage and Bo's unshakable resolve. The air was thick with the threat of violence, and for a moment it seemed inevitable. But something in her father's eyes faltered when he looked again at Tessa, standing tall, unbroken, her chin lifted. She was no longer the cowering girl he had controlled. She was a woman who had found her strength. "You'll regret this," he spat, before jerking the reins and wheeling his horse around. His sons followed, though not without casting one last, conflicted glance at their sister. When the dust finally settled, Tessa's knees nearly gave out. Bo caught her, his arm steady around her waist. "You did it again," he murmured, pride threading through his quiet tone. Tears blurred her vision, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of release, of victory. For the first time in her life, she had stood against the man who had broken her, and she had not bowed. That night, as she and Bo sat together by the fire, she leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The crackle of the flames filled the silence, but words were no longer needed. For she knew, deep in her heart, that whatever storms lay ahead, she would not face them alone. Summer settled over the valley, warm and golden, the fields alive with the hum of insects and the whisper of tall grass swaying in the wind. Life on the homestead carried a rhythm that was both simple and profound. Bo worked the fields, strong and steady as ever, while Tessa tended the garden, gathered eggs, and brought laughter into the quiet cabin that had once known only silence. But even as the days passed in peace, a shadow lingered at the edge of their happiness. Tessa knew her father's pride would not allow her defiance to go unanswered forever. And though her brothers had begun to soften, uncertain in their loyalty to him, she feared that the storm he carried would one day return. She no longer trembled at the thought, but she could not ignore it. One morning, as she stood at the well drawing water, she saw a lone figure approaching along the dirt road. For a moment, dread tightened her chest, but it was not her father. It was her eldest brother. He rode slowly, unarmed, his expression heavy. Bo emerged from the barn, his shoulders tensed, but the man raised a hand in peace. "I ain't here for a fight," he said, his voice rough. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the earth. His eyes found Tessa's, and for the first time she saw no cruelty there, only weariness. "I didn't know," he admitted, his tone raw. "Didn't see it. Or maybe I didn't want to. But Pa's wrath, it ain't right. And I can't follow him no more." Tessa's throat tightened. For years, her brothers had been her father's shadows, echoing his harshness, turning away from her pain. To hear those words now felt like a wound being stitched close. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "But I came to tell you you're free of him. We won't drag you back. Not me, not the others. Pa's losing his hold, and he knows it." Bo studied him carefully, weighing the truth in his words. Tessa, though, felt the weight of years lifting, a burden she had carried since childhood finally easing from her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her brother gave a stiff nod, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word. Tessa stood frozen long after he was gone, tears streaming down her face. Bo stepped to her side, his hand resting on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. She turned to him, her heart so full it ached. "Then it's truly over." That night, as the firelight bathed the cabin in warmth, Tessa and Bo sat close together. He took her hand, rough and calloused against her delicate fingers, and for the first time, he spoke of more than protection. "I never planned for this," he admitted, his voice quiet but sure. "Didn't think my life would turn this way. But I can't imagine it without you now. Tessa, will you stay with me? Not just as my guest, not just as someone I protect, but as my wife." Her breath caught, tears spilling anew, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming grace of the moment. She had been nothing once, or so she was told. Now she was everything to the man who asked her to share his life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, I'll stay. I'll be your wife." Their vows were spoken weeks later, not in a grand hall but beneath the open sky, with the hills as their witness and the wind carrying their promises. It was not splendor that bound them, but truth, two souls scarred by life, finding wholeness together. Seasons passed. The cabin grew warmer, not just with fire, but with love. And one winter night, the cries of a newborn filled the air. Tessa held her child against her chest, tears streaming as she looked down at the tiny face. Bo stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his eyes shining with pride. "You've given me a family," she whispered. "You gave me a home," he replied. The years of pain had not been erased, but they no longer defined her. Tessa was no longer the frightened girl who ran barefoot through the night. She was a wife, a mother, a woman who had found her strength. And with Bo beside her, she knew she would never walk in fear again. She was free. She was loved. She was home. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.